Why don't we start with Alabama, Florida?
Okay.
Since that was kind of the premier matchup of the weekend from at least the SEC standpoint, and I think in terms of the polls. So the final score here was Alabama 31, Florida 29. To your point of Alabama's offense in a microwave, it looked like through the first quarter, we were looking at a flash fry at a crock potting because it was 21-3 in favor of Alabama. They came out on fire until suddenly they weren't. Florida made some adjustments. The last 3 quarters of this game were a much, much different story. This was not an utterly dominant Alabama the rest of the way because Florida bottled them up on the ground. They had all the momentum late in this game, if we're being honest, and they could have tied it if not for the faulty 2-point conversion attempt that they tried for with about 3 minutes left. It's notable here, Anthony Richardson, who we talked a great deal about, did not play at all because of the hamstring injury that he sustained a week ago, which meant that this was entirely Emory Jones's show to run. Mm-hmm. And he looked, I thought, superb down the stretch. I mean, some mistakes here and there. He acknowledged as much in his post-game comments. But again, we kind of come back to this narrative about Alabama against a mobile quarterback that isn't totally shooting himself in the foot. If you've got a good batch of talent the way that Florida does, and somebody in Dan Mullen who clearly knows how to game plan at this point for Alabama's defense, yeah, this is fun. This is fun down the stretch. I thought Emory Jones did an awesome job extending the plays with his legs and really put Alabama on their heels defensively for the first time in what felt like forever. Bryce Young was good, much better early than late.
Sure.
Right? And again, it kind of comes back to this point of Alabama won. They got out of a hostile road environment with a W, but it seems entirely legit to me that we would ask the question on this Sunday morning, like, how vulnerable on a scale of 1 to 10 or a scale of 1 to 5 jacked Fowlers, as we did in our live stream on Saturday, like whatever metric you want to use, how do you quantify where you're at with Bama and that vulnerability metric?
I think it basically just, the question is, how much do you trust Zach Calzada at this point, right? I mean,
for A&M, right?
I don't think, right. I mean, it's at A&M in a couple weeks, October 9th. And, you know, Ole Miss looked crazy dominant against Tulane, and the defense looked good and got off the field pretty regularly against the Green Wave. But situationally, or just like, is KJ Jefferson the version of himself that he's shown early on? Will he be that near the end of the year? I think they have the second to last week. So those are the questions, right? It doesn't matter what vulnerabilities you see in Alabama. It's also, well, who's going to actually take advantage? Who actually has the quarterback and the defense and the coaching and the ability to adjust to take advantage of an Alabama offensive line that was beaten by Florida's front? You know, Brenton Cox was everywhere at linebacker, like beaten after that initial surge of 21 points, which, by the way, that Emory Jones interception, I think I felt 7 emotions in the time he was hit, threw it, the ball was in the air, and it was caught. It was sort of like, oh, here it comes. Oh, God. And then when you see the release kind of flutter and sail, you're like, oh, please don't end in something regrettable. And I wasn't rooting for Florida. I just didn't want this to get out of hand. And it did. And it was quickly turned into a touchdown a couple plays later. And what was it, 21-3 at that point?
Yeah.
And you're just like, man, I just don't want this to be a 35-13, like coast and crock-potting, whatever. And to Dan Mullen's credit, he leaned on the running game. He didn't put Emory Jones in a position where he had to make a ton of plays downfield. And from what I could tell, it did not look like a good time to try and tackle, what was it, Malik Davis and Dameon Pierce and Wright. And they just sort of look like greased up battle bots out there. And it just didn't look fun. And Alabama didn't have fun. And, you know, shout out to Alabama. This was a kind of a secret win your clunkers moment because they needed that missed extra point, right? So to force Florida to attempt the, I would say, ill-advised.
Very ill-advised.
Let's
Very
rock
ill-advised.
the mesh as long as we can possibly do it at the goal line on the 2-point conversion attempt, and it just didn't work out. Alabama snuffed it out, and Alabama escaped with the win. But I came away very impressed with Florida up front, with the ability to adjust to a very difficult run game to defend. And I came away impressed with what Alabama looked like coming out of the second half and getting those scoring drives, and Bryce Young under pressure, making plays, not making mistakes, and he nearly did a couple times. Yeah. But yeah, for Alabama to go into the swamp with what they are lacking in terms of what they had in previous seasons, I came impressed all the way around. There's no such thing as a moral victory, but I've certainly upgraded my thoughts about Florida's ceiling. Oh
my God. With this version of Florida moving forward, if it is this version of Florida.
And added Anthony Richardson, presumably.
Added Anthony Richardson for sure. This version of Florida is good enough to run the table the rest of the way and win the SEC East. Now, they've got the big one against Georgia. We could talk about Georgia.
I think they're favored in that. They won't be favored, but yeah.
They won't be favored, but I think they're good enough. If they're good enough to go toe-to-toe with Bama, if they're good enough to stop the bleeding against Alabama, which is low-key very difficult to do.
You're not worried about Florida State poisoning the food of Florida? I don't know what the strategy is for the Noles at this point. I'm just spitballing here. Maybe hacking them and making them distraught ahead. I don't know.
Well, look, this was a good game. It was better than you might have expected if, like me, you turned it off after the first quarter thinking it was going to be a disaster.
Right.
Florida, to their credit, did a good job, and Bama got a tough road win. It's not easy to go to the swamp and win. 31-29 was your final.
Hey, thanks for watching. Consider, if you haven't, subscribing to the channel and hitting that little bell to be alerted, and listening to the podcast at solidverbal.com.